So let me start telling you a story. So I was once speaking at a conference up in Davenport, Iowa, and there was a table full of, and it was the lunch buffet, and I was speaking after lunch. And so I'm on the buffet line, and there's this guy in front of me, admin guy I'm kind of talking to. And, there's a table next to the line that's giving out stickers that basically say, don't click on shit. If you go to conferences, you know who gives these stickers out and everything like that. And the guy grabs a whole bunch. He's like, oh, I really need a whole bunch of these stickers because I got users who keep clicking on shit. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, they just can't stop clicking on all that shit. I'm like, wow, you must give them a lot of shit to click on. And then he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, how are they Are they doing this on company systems? He's like, well, yeah. And he go, are they bringing this in on USB drives purposefully to put it on? It's like, no. I go, well, why do you keep giving them all that shit to click on if you don't want them to click on that shit? And then he's like, and then I go, by the way, if you know they're going to click on that shit, that you keep giving them, why don't you do anything about that? And he's like, what do you mean? And he knew what I meant, but that's kind of the fundamental problem. I mean, we're see this. So for example, CISA, however they want to pronounce it today, CISA has this new document on how to stop users from clicking on phishing messages. What's the best way to stop users from clicking on phishing messages? Don't give them the phishing messages in the first place. And everybody's like, oh, we just need, they put awareness as the first thing. I'm like, no, the first thing is don't give users phishing messages to click on. That's fundamentally how you stop users from clicking on phishing messages. Now, I'm not saying that's possible, never to let a phishing message get through or whatever, because somebody really smart will get will get something through. But the problem is our first line of thing is, oh, that user, what an idiot. Oh, what a stupid user. He keeps clicking on stuff. I'm like, who's the person that keeps clicking on, giving them the stuff to click on? And why do you not do anything? Because you know they're eventually going to click on it. And this is the problem we seem to have in cybersecurity. I'm blaming users for everything that happens. I have this expression, some people hate this, but behind every stupid user is a stupider security professional. And the reason is at the end of the day, there's really, well, I'll keep going. So how many people remember the Twitter attack? This happened about 2020, midsummer 2020. And what happened was all of a sudden, major accounts were getting taken over by somebody who's trying to do a cryptocurrency scam. And they were able to essentially break in and put out posts on President Obama, President Biden, all these people's Twitter feeds saying, go to this thing and get your free crypto or whatever. And they were able to steal $100,000, breaking into major accounts with tens of millions of people. And then they went ahead and started saying everybody came out in the press and all this sort of stuff. Twitter, ironically, had some security engineer come online and basically put up blog posts. And all the feedback from Twitter was on these corporate blog posts where this engineer was basically saying, well, it's a highly sophisticated social engineering phishing attack, yada, 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 and we're doing this. We've implemented enhanced security awareness and so on. It's a master criminal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then what happened was then they started doing the investigation. And all of a sudden, the mastermind became a 17-year-old mastermind who somehow was able to compromise the entire Twitter infrastructure. And the greatest irony was the only person at the time whose account was not able to be taken over was Trump's account. And the reason Trump's account was not being able to take over was because in 2018, somebody was a contractor in Germany, was just fed up, and he was working, and it was his last day at work. He thought, what the hell? I'm going to do what I think everybody should have done, 2 years ago, and he deleted Trump's account back in 2018. So because of that happening, they put specific protections on Trump's account, and as a double check so no random engineer could just delete it. But they never did anything else on all the other accounts on Twitter that have, even more followers than him. I mean, just imagine Taylor Swift's account these days, what that would have. But yes, there was a lot of social engineering. And what the person did was they essentially figured out who help desk people were, who admins were through LinkedIn, contacted them, figured out that there was multi-factor authentication, set up a man-in-the-middle attack type of web page where they went ahead and said, hey, there's a problem with your account, please log into this thing. They went ahead, captured the multi-factor authentication. They then went ahead and were able to essentially capture that, log in as the employee, and it turns out 20% of Twitter's staff had access to the administrator tools which were available on a SharePoint website. So all of a sudden, that means basically at the time about 1,000 people could have changed anybody's password at their choosing, and that was fundamentally what was built in there. So yes, was this like a super sophisticated attack? You got to give the person credit for a little bit of ingenuity, got to give them motivation, but this was not something, the word 17-year-old or phrases 17-year-old and mastermind should never be put together. Especially when you're talking about the type of, theoretically, security expertise Twitter would like to have you believe that they have. So anyway, this is probably the fundamental issues that we're all seeing. Like again, here's this. I should go ahead and say at the same time around Twitter, do people know Cloudflare? A lot of people don't know their position. Cloudflare is basically content delivery network where you basically have them as your point of presence, so you put your website on Cloudflare. Cloudflare basically has it mirrored all over the world. And at one point in time, there was actually during the summer of 2020, around the same time as the Twitter attack, all of a sudden there was like a complete outage of many websites, and Cloudflare essentially went down. And in the greatest juxtaposition, I don't use that word a lot, but juxtaposition, the CEO of Cloudflare went online, and he actually took to Twitter to give people constant updates. And he was essentially saying, okay, our network's down, we're investigating, we're not sure why, et cetera, et cetera. Then what happened was like a day or two later, they said, we figured out the problem. A problem is an engineer made a routing table, they made a one-line error in modifying a routing table, which took down our whole network. So anyway, what happened? And then somebody replied back on Twitter to the CEO, I would hate to be that engineer. And this guy kind of is a jerk, if you ever had to deal with him. But he actually said something that I truly respect. And his quote was, mistakes happen. The root problem was we didn't have systems in place to keep them from causing a widespread issue. That's a problem of leadership that he's responsible for more than the engineer who made the typo. And that to me is taking massive credit. Because I'm not talking about this wasn't necessarily, well, you could say availability is a security issue, but in general, they're talking about a system-wide problem where the CEO said no single user should make an error on our network that causes the entire network to go down. And you got to give them credit for that, because that's a different way. Because here is the CEO, not of Cloudflare, not the CEO of Twitter, going on Twitter to make comments in real time, as opposed to a random engineer making fully edited blog posts that blame users for all their mistakes and the outage of multiple accounts. Now, the reason that's a 2020 account thing, and I keep it in here, is because in 2022, last year, I don't know how many people remember this, but Twilio, major infrastructure type of provider, and 130 other companies basically fell victim to the same type of attack that happened in 2020, where their engineers were getting phishing attacks, essentially, the man-in-the-middle social engineering attacks, calling up asking for the MFA authentication. And they fell victim to the same attack 2 years later. And the greatest irony, Cloudflare was also attacked in the very same way. And their engineers gave up their credentials, but Cloudflare had an extra layer of protection, specifically being that they use YubiKeys, hardware keys, that you need to have in your computer to authenticate the computer itself to the network. which added an extra layer of protection so a user giving up their credentials was not going to go ahead and give them access. So again, even though personally I don't like the CEO of Cloudflare, they have been doing some awesome things regarding understanding the human problem and taking steps to prevent it. Now let's talk about a lot of things, because in cybersecurity we have this major problem where we think we are this special snowflake that is unique to the world, and we have all these incredibly unique problems like cybersecurity. If you read all our thought leaders in the industry, we are the only profession in history that ever had to deal with human error, right? You know, but you stop and think about it, every profession deals with human error. So for example, safety science, those are people who analyze workplace injuries and things like that and try to figure out how to reduce workplace injuries. You know, it also includes people who figure out, okay, maybe we should have like a big red light on the top of a car for like driver safety. I don't know how many people are old enough to remember when there was no red light on the roof of the car, if you know what I'm talking about, or the rear window, as opposed to just like the brake lights and everything. Anyway, safety science, when they started doing things, it was always, their investigations were, why was that person stupid enough to get themselves killed? And all the investigations always began with the assumption that whoever got themselves killed was the root of the problem. And that's how it pretty much was, because, you know, people have been like having to deal with workplace injuries, human error, like since for agricultural age, but especially with the industrial age, when they started having factories and things like that. Because let's face it, factory workplace injuries cost companies millions and millions and potentially billions of dollars in the aggregate. Why? Because somebody gets injured, then they're out of work, they get sued, they might have to shut down the factory line, potentially they have to pay more for insurance if they're covered by insurance, and so on. But generally, they always looked at the user was where, and I say user and employee or whatever, always, simultaneously, but basically, they always look at the problem was the user is the problem. The injury happened here, so there is where the problem is, that the user somehow created this problem. And that's how essentially old school safety science was. And that to me is like saying, okay, well, if canaries die in coal mines, we just need healthier canaries. Now, hopefully most people get this, but you know, what happened is in olden days, like I don't know how old, but you know, before they had like chemical sensors, they would take canaries into coal mines because if there was poisonous gas in coal mines, canaries would die pretty easily. And so the canaries would basically drop dead. People knew to get out of the coal mine. And so, you know, these days we're saying, okay, well, you know, today we're saying, well, if a user clicks on a phishing message, we just need a more aware user. We just need to give them better training. We need to give them these micro-learnings and phishing simulations. Again, that's like saying that our users just need to have a gas mask like the canaries in the coal mines. And there's a fundamental problem, because the problem, and hopefully you'll realize, is not that a user or a canary dies in a coal mine. The problem is that there's poisonous gas in the coal mine that causes the canary to die. Much like if there's a phishing message that causes the user to ruin the network in theory, it's the environment, not the user themselves, that's the fundamental problem. So anyway, obviously though, I should say you don't want a canary to drop dead because of old age or a heart attack. So you do need reasonably healthy canaries. But again, the purpose of a canary is to be part of the system and to die before people will die, much like the users are essentially our canaries. Now, this is the proximity fallacy. Basically, it's the fallacy that where something happens is the root cause of the fundamental problem. That's not the case. I kind of beat this to death a little bit, but I'll just leave it at that. So for example, if a bus driver's driving a bus, and the bus breaks down, do you blame the bus driver because the bus driver's in control? I mean, if an engine blows up, you know, are they supposed to check the engine, go through all the records, see when the last oil change was and so on? Maybe pilots have to do that, but you don't expect bus drivers, taxi drivers to have to show up and go through the entire repair repair records for all the equipment that they drive. But, essentially, that's what they started doing. Then there's also like when surgeries happen in medical facilities. Anybody here ever work in a medical facility type of thing? So, you can confirm or deny, but hospitals have what they call inquiries on a periodic basis, where what they do is if a patient dies in the hospital, they have the attending physician get up and basically describe why the patient died, and then they beat up the doctor to say, hey, why did that patient die while under your care? And what happened was, this was like they start realizing, it's like, wait a second, that seemed like the right decision at the time. You didn't just take a scalpel and put it through the guy's neck or something like that. You wanted to make a good decision. And when safety science started investigating medical incidents and why patients die in hospitals, what they found was that every time you actually go in and let's say like a surgery, they asked the surgeon, okay, why did you cut that, which pretty much led to the patient's death? They're like, well, that was the right decision to make at the time. And they're like, yeah, I guess it was. Then they go back a decision, like, why was that decision made? And then they go back and say, well, I made that decision because of this. Then they go back to the previous decision, and so on and so on and so on. And what they found was when there is doctor error in one form or another, the actual error occurred 100 decisions or more before the actual action that caused the death. So they had to go back and figure out, okay, why did all these things happen? So anyway, just figuring out this happened right here and now, so that's the problem, is not the real problem that they found when they started investigating things. And, I'm going to say that the reason that a lot of people are sitting here and like have the attitude, because everybody thinks, oh, I'm calling security professionals stupid. I'm not. The problem that we have is vendors are basically the only people providing information. You go to all these vendors that are selling security awareness materials, and they're out there saying, okay, well, we're going to conquer human error. Really? If you conquer human error, you should get like the Nobel Prize or something like that. Human error has been a problem since humans existed. But, you have all these vendors. And here's the key concept that they're not telling you. Awareness is not a strategy. Awareness to stop a user from clicking on a phishing message, that's a tactic. A tactic is, for example, there are wars out there. We all know that. One of the things in Ukraine war, which is the blessing for Ukraine, is that yes, Russia has aircraft, Russia has tanks, Russia has armies and so on that are really individually, in theory, powerful. The problem is that those are each tactics. Russia could never get their act together to put them together as a strategy to, for example, have air support to facilitate a land operation, as an example. That's why the U.S. was really, really good at our Iraq wars, because we had strategy to have first air power do one thing, then it was followed by the military, which had air support. So when tanks were going in, there was air support to look for insurgents and things like that. And it was used as a combined strategy. Individual tactics were used as a strategy. Now, the problem is awareness is, and people think, I wrote Security Awareness for Dummies. I believe in the importance of awareness, but awareness itself is a tactic. Anti-malware itself is a tactic. Data leak prevention, a tactic. Secure email gateways, a tactic. But what we need is a strategy. But everybody's out there saying, we're going to stop human error. We're going to create the human firewall. They're giving you the impression that a tactic is a strategy, and it's not. And likewise, regular firewalls suck. Why would you want a human one? I mean, regular firewalls fail all the time. And that's okay. Nobody ever says, hey, you know what? I got anti-malware and I got a firewall, so I'm all covered for security. Anybody would be laughed out of the room for saying that. But in this case, because of all the information we hear from vendors and nobody's out there challenging this, everybody thinks, oh yeah, we're going to have awareness and create the human firewall, and that's going to take care of all our problems. So, that's really where this lies. So what happened was, and evolving this a little bit, new school safety science came up, well, it shouldn't be new school, but started becoming popular around 1950s, 1960s. They started saying when a person is injured in the workplace, that person is a symptom of a problem of the workplace, not the actual cause of their own injury. So for example, when they start going ahead and they investigate all these different incidents that happen, like, so let's say, for example, somebody falls off a somebody falls off a ladder. The first question they ask and have learned to ask is, why is that person on the ladder in the first place? What part of their job do they need to be on a ladder? For example, if you have really common things that are on top instead of on the lower level, let's put all the most common things on the lower levels so that they have ready access and don't need to get on a ladder, as an example. They look at the environment, they look at the workplace, and they look at any time there's an injury. We're not just saying, why was that person stupid enough to injure themselves? They look at it and say, why did we put that person in the position where in theory they can cause themselves to be injured, and what could we have done to stop that person from being in that position in the first place? How could we have better protected that person? And then at the same time, if we know somebody might be injured, what could we do to stop the potential for that person for harm to be as much as possible? So for example, if you see a lot of people climb up tall towers or whatever, they now have a safety line on them where they go ahead and they have some sort of hook so that if the person falls off the ladder, falls off the rope, with one of those like massive cranes that they have to climb up on, there's another rope tied to them, so if they fall off, yes, they're dangling, but at least they're not going to be dropping 600 feet. So they've started to look at things like that. But again, proximity is just a symptom, and user error is not what's wrong with the entire system. So anyway, how many people remember this scene of like the Sully landing the airplane on the Hudson River? And now, how many people saw the movie Sully, by the way? Okay, for those of you that haven't seen the movie Sully, that was like the dramatization of this. Now let's face it, the airplane landing on the river was just a little piece of the movie, obviously. The bulk of the movie was the safety inquiry on why the plane ended up on the Hudson River. And the whole movie was pretty much about the investigation of this incident. And what happened was they actually did have simulators, and they had other pilots that simulated the same type of thing happening, and they were able to make it back to LaGuardia Airport without having to land on the Hudson River. So the whole movie was about Sully, who was pretty much a hero for getting all his people off safely. He was bastardized because, hey, all these people in the simulator were able to make it back. Why didn't you? And what they did was, because it's like the first inclination of all these things, again, is why did the pilot do something stupid? Even though it was even though it was birds, it's like even if you lose engines, you should be able to make it back. Then when they realized in the simulation, they automatically went ahead because the pilots in the simulator knew my engines will go out and I know what to do once the engines go out. They didn't realize if you don't know the engines are going out, you have to figure out what's going on. You have to take the time to try to restart the engines and so on. Instead, the pilots in the simulator, engine 1 out, okay, that's bad. Engine 2 out, okay, let's go right back to LaGuardia and we'll call in as we're going in. As opposed to Sully, which it first happened, it's like, okay, engine going out, trying to control it. Engine 2 going out, okay, can we restart it? Can we do all these other things and so on? What are the alternatives? Or, Teterboro Airport, which is a private airport across from in New Jersey, can we go there? But instead, the other pilots knew, oh, let's just swing back. So, they were looking at this. These are 737 MAX jets. How many people remember when 737 MAX jets were crashing into the ground? And what happened was they looked at 737 jets, and all of a sudden people were like, planes would go out of control of the pilots. And what happened was 2 of the planes crashed and a few other planes didn't. And they're like, gee, why are these pilots so bad that they're crashing their planes nose first into the ground? And then what they figured out was, it's like, well, what happened, and this is like a whole issue, 737 jets are really common. The controls are common. They're 737. If you fly them, 500 series, 600, 700, 800, 900. Then they had these 737 MAX. The MAXs carry more people. They move the engines around. And Boeing did not want to go ahead and call this a new aircraft. Because if you call it a new aircraft, it requires a whole bunch of new safety, pilots require new training, a whole bunch of other stuff. So Boeing just said, okay, we're just going to call this a 737. And what happened was they moved the jet, even though it's different, handled differently, basically controls were the same and all that. But they also tweaked a few other things. They tweaked the warnings. They tweak, for example, so there's these things on attack, AOAs, I forgot, altitude things or so on. And what would happen was, every so often, these AOAs are on both sides of the plane, and they indicate whether the plane's going up or down. And if if one indicator was going down while the other one indicator was going up, it would give out a warning. Well, what Boeing did was they kept the warning, but it was an optional feature that many airlines did not want to pay for. So this warning that was previously there that there was a problem between the two was taken away. That was number one. And number two, it defaulted the wrong way. That, for example, it defaulted to as opposed to assuming it's going down or whatever. Well, here's another thing you have to understand in planes. If a plane is losing altitude, what do? I know this sounds counterintuitive, but you aim it into the ground so it picks up speed and then the wings get more lift. So what these things were doing was it looked like the plane was going down and the autopilot would force the plane down even more so it could pick up speed and then get more lift. And what would happen was the pilots didn't know what was going on. Why is this plane trying to nosedive me? They would take it up. Pilots did not know to, by default, turn off the autopilot and don't ever turn it back on. But what would happen was some pilots were turned it off, took control, and then everything was fine. And then okay, let's go back to normal operations. And then they turned it on, and then it nosedived the plane again. And that's why these things were happening. But they were always trying to blame pilot error, not the system that didn't tell them that the planes function differently, that warning indicators are not there anymore, and so on and so on and so on. They just kept blaming the pilots. So anyway, could the pilots have saved the plane? Yeah, they could have. The other pilots did save the plane. But it was this combination of software, it was a combination of faulty sensors, it was improper training because pilots never received any new training. It was at best, it was signing the Microsoft licensing agreement, that's 58 pages, and you have to say, yes, I agree to this or something like that. There's actually a funny South Park thing about that. But anyway, they changed indicators, the problems, again, there were systematic problems with the whole thing. Now, like I said before, it's not really you. You've been fed with the problem that the users are the problem. We just need the human firewall, so on, so on. I'm sick of the phrases, your users are the last line of defense. If the users are the last line of defense, you should be fired as a security professional. Because think of it this way, do you want a user who could theoretically be malicious to be your last line of defense? They're not. What happens when a user downloads malware? When a user downloads malware, does the user actually encrypt every bit? No. The operating system encrypts every bit, and so on. And then the network facilitates that attack going throughout the network. The user might initiate an action, which I'll come back to, but they initiate the action, but your system takes over. You should have things like data leak prevention, anti-malware, and all these other actions to stop users from doing harmful actions. So anyway, stop looking at these users as your potential paragon of virtue and savior and stuff like that. So, focus, again, it's all focusing on the proximity of the error. I mentioned before, accounting. Sorry, gotta love Newman. Hopefully, if you don't know who Newman is, I hate you. But anyway, so accounting. Think of any other profession that has to deal with human error more than accounting. You have to have people who enter data. You have to have people who pull data. You have to have people who verify data and everything like that. The entire accounting profession has been pretty much built upon people make mistakes, either unintentionally or intentionally or maliciously to do things. Like, for example, we have CISOs walking into meetings and say, well, we just lost $20 million to a ransomware attack because some user clicked on a message. We can't blame the user. And everybody's like, okay, well, let's just suck it up. But then imagine a CFO walking into a meeting and saying, well, we just had a $20 million financial loss because some user made an error, caused a bad bank transaction or something like that. It's like, they're like, and we can't blame the user. And the CEOs are like, right, we don't blame the user, we blame you, because as the CFO, you're responsible for putting financial systems in place that account for likely human errors. And if it wasn't likely, why weren't there controls to put in things that stop things so badly and other stuff like that? And we don't look at it in the same way, and we really have to start looking at it in the same way as other professions. Then there's scuba diving. I'm a master scuba diver trainer, and I certified to teach people diving and stuff. And the thing is, when you look at an environment like this, theoretically, and I'm making an assumption, I don't know where, I just found the picture on the internet, but this person here is probably the instructor that's watching that person do something that's known as a fin pivot, where they're going up and down as they breathe just to show they can control buoyancy, like how they float. As you can see, there's 4 other people there. Or 3 other people. Yeah, 3 other people who can potentially do something stupid. I was certifying people once, and one of the people here decided to see what's under this platform. No matter how many times I tell people when we get down, do not get off the platform. Some moron is always going to get under the platform. It doesn't matter. But in diving, it's like we go in. We don't go ahead and just say we expect users to do what we tell them. When we get down there, we're doing all this thing. We have insurance before people get in the water. We make sure, and this is before they even learn to scuba dive. First, they take 100 hours of online classes, which is how not to get yourself killed in theory. Then they take a test. Then if you're smart, they show up to a dive school. You make them take the test again to make sure they didn't cheat. Then you go ahead and then you put them in a pool before you put them in there. And before you teach them any scuba skills, you make sure they can float for 10 minutes and then swim 200 meters. Do we care if they know how to float or swim? No, that's what all the equipment's for. But the reality is we just want to make sure they're not going to freak out in the water. So anyway, we do that. Then we teach them basic skills on the side of pools. We check it, they check it, all that. Have them demonstrate basic skills in the shallow end, then slowly take them to the deeper end. And then by the time they get here, you're not more than 30 feet deep. It's really hard to kill yourself in less than 30 feet deep. But anyway, even before that, we're insured, they're insured. Well, we take out insurance on them even though they don't know it. The school's insured, the dive facility's insured. We know where all the hyperbaric chambers are and everything else, how to call medical and things like that. But anyway, even when we know all this is going to happen, people are going to go ahead, we always, you can't see back there, and the reason I have this picture is that there is somebody else up there kind of watching everybody, which usually a smart instructor will take a dive master with them who can oversee things just to make sure that when an instructor is actually testing somebody and they're focused too much on one person, that there's somebody else qualified to make sure other people don't do stupid things, and I use stupid in quotes. Anyway, I'll come back to that. But anyway, where does the blame fall? When you look at an environment, and when you look at safety science, when they do things, they found studies that are pretty much 90% of workplace injuries are a result of the environment. For example, an unsafe environment where something might fall on people, where they have to go ahead and do things where they don't have the right equipment, where they're mentally doing too much, where you are overtaxing them both physically and mentally and so on. And those are the types of things where the environment is causing it. 10% in general, when they've actually started to study this, is because of user stupidity, if you want to call it that. I don't really want to call it stupidity, because sometimes users are doing things that they shouldn't be doing, but they're doing it for the right reasons. How many, for example, there's a concept called the compliance budget. And so let's say you're sitting at your desk and all of a sudden you have to run to a meeting. And you're late to a meeting, your boss is like, I need you there now, all that sort of stuff. But yet you're supposed to lock up your computer, you're supposed to put everything away, lock it down, et cetera, et cetera. What are you going to do? Are you going to run to the meeting, or are you going to be another couple minutes late to make sure you do all your security things perfectly? You're going to run to the meeting in all likelihood if you're like most people, because the cost of being late to the meeting is going to be higher than the likelihood of somebody potentially yelling at you for leaving your desk computer unsecured. But you have things like that where there's 10% might be the fault of the user for one reason or another. But what's that 10%? It might be carelessness, it might be blatant ignorance. it could be a lack of training. The one thing we don't like to say, when you make your user a last line of defense, what if they're malicious? 3 to 5% of the general population are sociopaths or psychopaths. These are people who will do you harm if given the opportunity. You've got to account for the fact that you have psychopaths and sociopaths working for you. So in some cases you know them, but in many cases you're not aware of them. They can be completely functional. Some people are blatant. You have to worry about the ones who are functional, who are really, but these people, if there's any opportunity to benefit them, regardless of the harm it might do to anybody else, they will try to take that opportunity. But you have to consider that, but still it's only 10%. And then generally, awareness, like general awareness programs, are only going to stop 20% of the problem. Because it's the ABCs of behavior. Antecedent, which is supposed to be information. I don't call it IBC because it's IBC is an illness, like an illness or something. But antecedent is like awareness, information, or so on. You give people information, that is supposed to impact the behavior. A behavior generates a consequence. The consequence then goes back and influences the behavior again. So for example, stereotypic one is you tell a child, don't put your hand on the flame because you'll get yourself burned. All of a sudden you point out something that seems to be real, you tell a child, don't do this, that's the first thing they want to do. All of a sudden they execute the behavior, but what happens? They burn their hand, and you know that consequence is going to impact their behavior. So 20% is only going to be solved because of antecedents, information, your awareness program. 80% is how your environment treats it. So for example, if you tell users, do not reuse your password, do not reuse your personal password with your work password, what happens? It's like, gee, I should not do that. But it also means, well, what's the consequence for doing the right behavior? The consequence for doing the right behavior is having to remember a dozen other passwords. That's kind of hard. That's a negative consequence. So a user is going to go ahead, reuse the password. The consequence is 99.9% a positive consequence because they have fewer passwords to remember. So therefore, they're going to go ahead and keep reusing their passwords. And it's not until you have password dumps on the internet where their accounts get hacked because of password reuse that they are going to change that behavior. But 99% of the time, that doesn't happen. So they have positive consequences for bad behavior. So keep that in mind. That's just general. So anyway, let's talk another science. This is counterterrorism, which is the concept of boom. Boom basically is, boom is the terrorist event. I just like this as an analogy. And then you have left of boom. If everybody ever hears, we're going to move left and shift left, that means you're trying to protect things before the attack. Then there's right of boom, which is the reaction time and so on, which is the detection and reaction, prevention, detection, reaction. Then there's resilience and whatever. But anyway, so if you have an incident at boom, which you think of the terrorist attack, then you have prevention and protection. So for example, in terrorist-related things, there are terrorists out there. You have some people, theoretically, who are responsible for tracking terrorists. Then you have other people who are responsible for figuring out where are we vulnerable to terrorists and let's try to secure that. So they go ahead, and some people put up those ugly barriers in front of federal buildings and stuff like that. You have other people who work for intelligence that try to track it. Maybe they work together, but usually it's separate groups of people. But you're trying to figure out what are you afraid of, then what are the vulnerabilities they'll exploit. Then you have, okay, the incident itself. Then you have things that are done at the time of the incident. For example, if you know there's an incident, you go ahead and you put in cockpit doors in airplanes. You put in blast-resistant cargo bins so it doesn't just blow up the plane. At least it contains it to a certain extent. Then you have other people who work on response recovery and resilience. Those people who work on, first thing is response. So if there's an attack, you have to have people come in. You have to know, for example, yes, what are the possible incidents? How many hospital beds do I need? How do I train first responders? Because terrorists are assholes. You already said I can curse. But terrorists are assholes. You know, one of the big concepts of terrorism attacks is secondary explosions. Like, for example, in the Boston Marathon bombing. There was the first bomb, and then there was a second bomb that was delayed by 10 minutes for the first responders to come in to blow up more people. So anyway, you have that going on, and you have to train people how to do it. Make sure there's the infrastructure in place. Then you have other people who then have to come in knowing something's going to happen. How do I get things up and running? Like the World Trade Center attack, even how bad it was showing how resilient the infrastructure was. The World Trade Center was a major communication hub. All financial transactions went through the World Trade Center for the most part. They were able to get it up, recover, put in new communication lines, get things up and running while a major communication center was blown up and so on. Then you have resiliency. These are people who are outside planning. We know attacks are going to occur. How can we put in an infrastructure that switches things over quickly if something does happen? How can we keep the system up and running and so on? And all these people have to work together. This should be how cybersecurity looks at our profession as well, which we kind of do. So first, let me have the concept. I teased this a little bit, but user-initiated loss. Pretty much, a user doesn't cause damage. If a user clicks on a phishing message that has loaded with malware, the user doesn't ruin your network. The user initiates an action, but the action has to go ahead and first be presented to the user. This is a critical concept. We have to give the user the phishing message in the first place. The user then has to make some decision, and they could either initiate loss or they don't. But once the user initiates the loss, that's where the attack itself takes over, and where the attack, for example, if you're going to download malware, okay, so does the system allow the user to download the malware? If the system allows it to download, does it allow it to install? If it allows it to install, will it allow you to execute? Will it allow it to go ahead and encrypt the whole system? Will it communicate to outside networks? All those things are independent of what any individual user can possibly do. The user just initiates the loss. You have to hopefully go ahead and take the user out of the loop so that they can't initiate the loss, try to lead them in the right direction when they're in the position to initiate the loss, and then to actually stop the realization of the loss to the best of your ability once the loss is initiated. So anyway, start with left to boom. And ideally, let's stop the user from being in the position to initiate the loss. With phishing, for example, if you don't give the user the phishing message, they can't initiate the loss, and so on. And maybe you could go ahead and re-engineer the process to take the user out of a process. For example, one thing where a lot of theft is being stopped now at fast food restaurants is fast food restaurants now put kiosks in place where you walk into McDonald's, you go up to a kiosk, and then you pay with your credit card or whatever. There's a lot of cash that is not walking away. There's a lot of credit card scams where cashiers at McDonald's and other restaurants don't have credit card skimmers anymore, which is a problem that they have to deal with periodically. Because what happens is these kiosks are taking cashiers out of the loop. So users are the only people interacting with money right now with these computers. And so only 5 minutes? Wow, I gotta go quicker. Anyway, but they prevent, they detect, and you create a culture with consequences. Here's the thing, awareness is one thing, but like I said with antecedent behavior consequence, the culture is the consequence. When I worked at NSA, what happened was there was one time, we always had to have our badge on. One time what happened was I was working midnight shifts. I had to work on this plotter. You had to take your badge off because it had a mechanical arm that would move around like a 3D printer. Got to use that example now. But it would move around like a 3D printer. And what happened was I had to run to the restroom. After I was done, I ran to the restroom. And then all of a sudden there was a guard in the hallway. The guard in the hallway stopped. It's like, "Where's your badge?" And I'm like, "It's at my desk." He's like, "We're going to your desk." I go, "You're not allowed anywhere near my desk." Anyway, so he's like, "I'll wait by the door." So anyway, I go to the desk and where the plotter was, and I couldn't find it. And then I'm looking under, and then my coworker was like, "Are you looking for something?" I'm like, "Where is that effing badge?" And he's like, "You mean the one that should always be around your neck at any time while you're in?" I'm like, "Give me my," and the guard was like, "Is there a problem? Do you think I ever forgot that badge again?" You know, that is a culture of improving things. So anyway, Then governance. More people, right, to most people, governance is a set of documents you keep on a shelf or something to show the auditors once a year. Governance should tell people how to do their job step by step with security embedded as part of the process, not added as part after the fact. I'll say that, I don't have much time, but when a user is presented with an opportunity, do they do that? Do they prevent it? More important, hopefully they report it and so on. And again, remember, there's also malice. Make sure you're not interacting with malice. Then policies and governance. One of the things, and sorry, I know I'm going to run over with this story, but what happens is, I was once CISO of an organization, and we had a state government that was our client. And so one of my guys, I wake up in the morning, and I see a message from my SOC manager, and he's like, you know, that the state government had a bomb threat. And I was like, really? And anyway, so he shows me this, and he's like, the SOC for the state government asked us to evaluate it, and they said, you know, it basically said, I left a bomb in your facility, send me 5 Bitcoins or else I'll blow up your bomb, or something like that. And they asked my SOC to say, does this look like a real message, or is this official? They're like, it doesn't look like a real bomb threat? And they're like, okay, and they report it as a phishing message. Anyway, I wake up, I text the CISO who I'm friends with. I go, it sounds like you had an interesting night. And he's like, and then he calls me up. He's like, what do you mean I had an interesting night? I go, you don't know about your bomb threat? He's like, what bomb threat? Because they didn't even report it. They just were like Elmer Fudd's. You know, Elmer Fudd was always on the lookout for the wascally rabbit, Bugs Bunny. If Bugs Bunny put on a wig and a dress, Elmer Fudd could not recognize could not recognize Bugs Bunny. That's what we're creating with all these awareness. Look out for the hacker and all that stuff. As opposed to thinking, what is the right thing to do? A threat of violence should automatically trigger the right thing to do is a threat of violence needs to be reported whether it looks real or not. And they failed because of this. So we had to go ahead and get the message from our email archive because it was off their email archive to their phishing provider. So anyway, write a boom. Once the loss has been initiated, does the environment should stop it? I beat that to death pretty much already. And then go back to a post-mortem like I mentioned the medical industry does. It sounds difficult, but frankly, safety science, medicine, every other profession out there is constantly doing this. And then I'm also going to say if you mitigate the user problem, which is 90%, you mitigate the environment, you're going to handle most of the 10% by default. I mentioned awareness. Awareness is still mandatory. Awareness is a valid risk reduction technique, no matter what, because every layer should be, there's never such a thing as perfect security. The only people who sell you perfect securities like human error conquered are fools, liars, or a combination of both. You got to go ahead and realize that everything is a risk reduction tool, and it's kind of total quality management, Six Sigma. The more you can get the phishing message out, the better, even we know people, aware or not, are going to click, but the more you can cut it down, even if you cut it down by half, that's less your infrastructure is going to have to deal with. So anyway, our implementing tactics or strategies, here's like a, basically here's the layered approach. I'll get you a copy of the slides, but pretty much have governance, technology, infrastructure. Attacks have to make their way through the layers and then out through the other layers to be realized. And then, anyway, I'm a little over, I think very over, but anyway, attacks in order to be realized have to go ahead, perimeter devices, they have to get through the mail servers, then they have to be looked at by the users. You have nudges, actions, confirmation, policies, procedures, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, I'm running over. You can
And let's all give Winkler
yeah.
applause. Sir.
Oh, thank you.